In our study of the Kena Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo is now elaborating on the deeper sense of the parable of the gods. The story is of Brahman choosing to challenge the gods, to help them outgrow their limited self-awareness, to discover that their power and their victory is his power and his victory in them and through them. But he does this not as an angry God, not as a jealous God, as we see in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is rather a next step in their evolution. As they have struggled to overcome the anti-evolutionary forces, they have come to their victory. It is now time for them to move on to a still deeper truth. And in this sense, this is an event that is not only a cosmic event in evolution, but it is our story in the life and journey of each one of us. And so, he places himself before them, but in a manner that they are unable to see, unable to recognize, only a vague and tremendous presence. And so there is an alarm and a confusion, and the gods now seek to know what is this. And in the story which we have already summarized before, they first place Agni before them to find out. He fails and returns. They place Vayu. He fails and returns. Then they ask, in this forward, the form vanishes. But Indra does not return. He pursues into the domain of the ether, where he meets the woman, Uma, who reveals that this is the eternal, and the victory of the gods is the victory of the eternal. In the text we have been studying, Sri Aurobindo is now preparing us to recognize what these three gods represent, both in the cosmic movement and within us. As a first step, he distinguishes the concept of the gods in the Upanishads, the Veda, and this is the text we read last time, that in the Veda, the gods, their source and their true identity. They know the Brahman, they dwell in the Supreme Godhead, their origin, home, and is the superconscient truth. And then he explains their origin and home, they are still cosmic powers, and so they operate all the way down to the most material planes. It is true they manifest themselves in man in the form of human faculties and assume the appearance of human limitations, manifest themselves in the lower cosmos and assume the mold of its cosmic operations. But this is only their lesser and lower movement. And beyond it, they are forever the one, the transcendent and wonderful, the master of force and delight and knowledge and being. They know themselves to be that. And all these terms are used in the Veda to describe the divine. But all the gods in the Veda know themselves to be that, even as they act out through the whole cosmos down into the lowest operations in the material domain. In the Upanishadic period, or in the Upanishadic description of the gods, they are not conscious of this unity. How did that transition take place? And this Sri Aurobindo explains. But in the Upanishads, the Brahman idea has grown and turned the gods from this high preeminence so that they appear only in their lesser human and cosmic working. Much of their other Vedic aspects they keep. So we see a transition from the Vedic age to the Upanishadic age in this sense that the gods have been as if pushed down and we are aware of their lower working, not of their higher status. Why? Because in the transition, the status of that higher consciousness has been as if subsumed by the concept of Brahman, the one that is the all. So he says, the Brahman idea has grown and cast down the gods from this high preeminence. How does that happen? We must recognize that the human mind and its concepts are flexible. We tend to think that certain ideas are fixed because in our mind or in our age, these ideas are fixed. We do not realize that there is no idea that can be fixed in isolation and cut off from the continuum of consciousness, of reality. Our mind, because that's the habit of the mind, carves out a piece in what is otherwise a continuum. And in that piece, it gives a label. Another piece, it cuts out, gives another label, and so on. What happens to the things between two pieces, which are unlabeled still? The fact that there is something there ensures eventually that it needs to be labeled by the mind. And since continuum, you cannot have a set of labels. So inevitably the ideas which have been labeled and which have been narrow begin to grow and expand to include the rest of the experience. This growth begins to happen when that in-between consciousness or idea becomes relevant. We start with certain crude and simple ideas, which are all that is relevant for us. As we grow in complexity, in sophistication, in wider, richer awareness, we discover that our categories were not simplistic, and there are things in between. If the things in between are experienced as distinct enough, we cut them out and give a new label. If they're not distinct enough, then these ideas tend to blend, to extend, to include these elements. Now this is true not only in the domain of ideas, it is equally true in the domain of languages, because language is a means of representing ideas. So a word may have a fixed meaning, let's say 500 years ago, and 100 years or 200 years later, the word has already shifted, expanded, now to include wider or associated experiences in a continuum, because humanity is growing and so we grow. Or it gets narrowed and pushed away by something else that grows. So if one grows, it can fill in a gap, or it can conflict with another and the other one adjusts itself to narrow down or shift a little. And this is the reason why you will find the meaning of words tends to flow and adjust and adapt. Often it also happens that the sounds associated with the word have themselves a certain force, and although an idea form may have been given to it, the sound itself attracts a particular vibrational quality in the association. And if the original idea was too narrow, the sound causes an expansion of the concept and the word becomes more flexible. Or it narrows down to the meaning around that sound idea. So you're in the writings that always when a word is given a fixed idea, it tends to drift, but the sound vibration tends to pull it back in the direction of its innate values. Let me give an example of a simple word such as quiz. The story behind the word is quite unusual. It originates in England at a time when the formalization of the language had not yet become so rigid, and there was a challenge made between two people. One of them said that he would introduce a new word in the English language overnight. And so the challenge was made, and that night he went around writing on all the walls an odd word that he just thought up, quiz, Q-U-I-Z. And he wrote it on the wall. And the next morning everybody woke up and looked at this word and said, what is quiz? What is quiz? What is quiz? And so the word acquired this association with a question, something unknown, something to be found. And in the collective vocabulary, it began to be used as the symbol for a puzzle, for an unknown, which then became a verb, quiz somebody, which then became an activity. Even today you have it as an activity. You have a quiz program. The word itself though has a certain vibrational quality, and that will act as a separate magnet. Although mind has fixed a meaning to it, it was already a fluid word, so it could adapt easily. Other terms are more interesting when you go into the etymology of words. Today when you speak of explain, when you use the word explain, X and plane, plane is making flat, and explain is extending out to make flat. If you go back a few hundred years, then the same word would have been used in this way, please explain the mat, meaning unroll the mat and make it flat, extend it out to make it plain. But over time the physical meaning has drifted out, and it has come only in the domain of ideas, explain yourself. I don't of course unroll myself and become flat, it is rather the thought and the content of what I am saying which is being unrolled and made plain, meaning bared, expressed openly. So you see nuances shifting, and it's interesting to see if ever there are two words with similar meanings, inevitably they tend to drift apart because they're too close and there are two words, and they'll always acquire directions. It's interesting to watch the developments, and in the field of linguistics, it's a whole fascinating exploration. But in the domain, affects or is a reflection of the in the Vedic experience, the idea of the underlying oneness is so strong. Everything is seen as aspect of the one. The mind itself of the Vedic rishis and of the age was intuitive, meaning it sensed in identity what it saw, felt, experienced, articulated from that identity. And in the identity, in their consciousness, they held the cosmos. And in the identity of the cosmos, they experienced the oneness in so many different aspects, facets, powers, specialized functions, but always emerging from the same. In that oneness, they saw all the gradations of consciousness, all equally expressions of the same one, and therefore within each, they saw all the others. So the fractal character of the universe emerges from the underlying overwhelming sense of oneness. The holographic character of the universe, every part is a representation of the whole and is connected, a narrow focus of the whole. This holographic character is also a natural result of the sense of oneness which overwhelms. The modern mind, being a rational mind, it takes pieces and joins them. It does not see wholenesses. It is a great struggle for it to rise out of its limitation and make an effort to think in terms of wholes, and they give it a special name, systems thinking, where you try to see the interdependences of all the pieces. But that's still not seeing wholeness. There is a higher grade where one begins to experience the sense of underlying one, where everything is expression, part, and aspect of one. And that's when we rise once again to the holographic and fractal experience of the universe. But they saw from there and expressed from there. So for them, the oneness did not need a special, exaggerated place. It was there always. They simply referred to it as he or that. Good enough, depending on the relationship one has. He as personality, that as impersonality. But oneness was there everywhere. Why give it a special name? But in the transition from the intuitive age to the rational, there is a fall, a decline. Now this itself requires some comment. Why at all there's a fall? We should be rising in evolution, isn't it? And Sri Aurobindo explains this elsewhere, that in the evolution, humanity had reached an intuitive consciousness, not having sufficiently developed the rational, and therefore a drop from the intuitive to complete the establishment and perfection of the rational mind, from there to reascend to the intuitive. And so the fall, which is characterized historically by the passage, the transition of power from the east to the west in the Battle of Troy. Sri Aurobindo refers to this as the beginning of the age where the intuitive fades and the rational begins to be highlighted. And after the decline into the rationality and its exaggerated place, quickly once again the mind must rise and reintegrate with the intuitive. And this is the passage we are at today, where modernism of the rational mind has failed us, and there is an attempt through a subjectivity to reach to something deeper and truer. And through the intuitive, the opening to the spiritual age would begin. But this is an aside. We're looking at the declining phase. As the mind shifts from the intuitive to the rational, things tend to get cut up and separated. The functions of the gods become more and more exaggerated in separateness. The oneness idea is still there but begins to fade. At which point it needs to be given a special name, because you're now looking too much at the aspects and parts. And so the Brahman idea, the term itself already present, but as an idea it begins to expand. We must come back always to the concept of Brahman, the one that is all that is the one. But meanwhile the gods, they get pushed out because they're also separate ideas, but they're being pushed out by the oneness which has a special exaggerated place as distinct from the aspects and powers. So Sri Aurobindo is using this term, and it happens gradually. He uses this word. In the Upanishads, the Brahman idea has grown and cast down the gods from this high preeminence. Repeatedly, when you are focusing on the aspects and powers of the gods and what they represent in a special functioning, you focus on the Brahman as distinct. And of course, that being the primary, you give it more importance, and these become less important, less, until they disconnect almost from the oneness. In the Kena Upanishad, which is one of the earlier Upanishads, this link is there, that the gods still represent the qualities, powers and aspects and functions in the Veda, but the oneness has been separated. Later on, when you go beyond the Upanishads in the still later period, particularly in the Puranic age, the gods have become almost human. Their functions have become much more narrow, even more specialized. Often their secondary or tertiary level functions have become their primary. And we've forgotten what they were in their larger cosmic working. So for example, Kubera becomes the treasurer of the gods, and Saraswati, she becomes the goddess of knowledge. As knowledge here is not the large Maheshwari, which is the wisdom, knowledge in a grand, all-encompassing vision. It is the practical knowledge as applied on in a material level. And you can see how it is true. Because in fact, all of the gods, all of the deities, remember in the original sense, they are all aspects of the one. And therefore, each carries all of them within themselves. So any one of those aspects of the aspects could be highlighted, and other larger functions fading out to these narrow ones. And at this point, they appear in their lesser human and cosmic workings, even to the extent that you can say it is the gods within us who are the functions of our psychological powers in the mind, life energy, or even in the body. So there will be detailed maps made. Which part of the body, which god resides? And when you picture it like this, suddenly the gods are these very little, almost gnome-like forms, imprinted in different parts and supervising those functions. Their cosmic aspect fades out even more. We've come to rigid, narrow, mentalized, physicalized mind forms. So he says much of the aspects they keep, but this is in the Upanishadic age. And now he describes what these three deities represent. Here, the three gods, Indra, Vayu, Agni, represent the cosmic divine on each of its three planes. Indra on the mental, Vayu on the vital, Agni on the material. In that order, therefore, beginning from the material, they approach the Brahman. Now immediately we can recognize, not only on a cosmic level, in the approach to the divine, it has to begin with the material, because it is from here that the effort begins in evolution. When the material consciousness tries to rise and reach and know the divine, it tries to grasp it in the way it knows, it fails and it falls back because it knows it cannot. And then a higher grade of power, life force, rises in evolution out of matter, reaches out to define the limits and possess. And when it fails, it also falls back. And out of it, a third power emerges, the mind. As the mind rises, it finds itself unable to seize, the form itself vanishes. Where is the divine? You cannot reduce it to mental terms. In the blankness, the mind does not fall back but pursues into the etheric domain where the woman reveals. So what that means we will see later. So if you see the stages of evolution, first matter struggles to realize the divine, and in the process matter evolves, complex forms, each seeking to embody form and capture the failing, and it lapses, if not for the fact that in the struggle already, in its intense effort, the other gods are also awakening with Agni. And so Vayu has begun to awaken, and as matter gives up, Vayu begins to take its place. And life emerges out of matter, struggling now to embody God, to know and manifest the divine. And as it struggles, life struggling with it, mind is emerging. But life is dominant. And when life fails to be able to express the divine and is beginning to give up, mind begins to rise and take its place in the effort. And where mind comes to its highest, it finds itself unable to recognize God. If it stops there, of course, it is left with a blank, and the mind will simply say, I am agnostic. I cannot know whether it is or is not. But innately in the mind is the impulse to know. It is not satisfied until it knows. And so it continues to pursue, even in its agnosticism. and crosses the agnostic phase and begins to perceive something, at which point it is helped and shown the way by the woman. You can see in these three phases, the complete emergence of the evolutionary development. It is true in us equally as part of our larger evolution, but it's also true within us as conscious human beings. In our first attempt to know the unknowable, what do we reach out with? To grasp in form. Even if the grasping in form in our thoughts is taking place in the mind's awareness, but still it is a formal aspect of the mind which comes forward. And you tell the child, oh, God is all powerful, living in heaven, and maybe you give a physical description. He can do this, he can do that, and he wears this beautiful crown and beautiful clothes, as you see in television serials when they represent, or in cinema. A form is all you can speak of, a name that you have to reduce it to. Of course, that fades, because afterwards you realize, well, he is not sitting in heaven, he is not in the clouds, he is not an object or a person that you can reach out and touch. And from there emerges an emotional connection. You feel his presence, you feel love for him or his love, or you feel the connection with the divine, and the call of the divine stirs your heart, calls your life. But that also takes you only so far. After a point you say, all these years that I have offered my worship, I have felt, but I still do not know you. And something reaches out which goes beyond an emotional contact to a deeper, not rational mind, but higher intuitive perception of the mind, going into the etheric level. And it is there that one begins to have a these three are not contrary to each other, but you can see how they support each other in one continuous movement. And this we have to keep in mind, although the description is of the gods one after another, keeping in mind the Vedic perspective, each of the gods is in each. In fact, in Agni's forward movement, he takes the triple status of knowledge, which Sri Aurobindo writes here, we discussed it last time. Agni moves forward to discover its nature, limits, identity, which are exactly the three functions of Agni, Vayu and Indra, but first done by Agni. Similarly, Vayu, when it reaches out, follows a triple sub-pattern, and Indra himself follows several steps. Each is in each, and this is our way of knowledge, as it is also the larger evolutionary progression. Briefly, I would like to digress to Sri Aurobindo's description of the gods in one of his writings, The Gods of the Veda. It's an article which has been brought out in the new volume of his Vedic studies. There he gives you in 15 bullet points the basic principles of the Vedic system. And he discusses how there is a whole elaborate psychology and the domains of the worlds, the seven strata of consciousness, each being within each. And man, although living here in the earth region, belongs to the domain of the vital and mental. And I read, he says, he is Manu, the thinker. The soul in him is the mental captain and guide of the life and body. He quotes from the Upanishad, Manomaya Prana Sharira Neta. He is mental, and yet he is guiding his life, body and the physical body. He dwells in them as a mental being. But at the level of mind, it's only a transitional stage. From here he has to rise to the supermind and the domain of the Satchidananda, for which The Vedic hymns are here to assist. So this is the larger purpose. In this he is helped by the gods, resisted by the asuras, and so on. And then comes bullet point number 8. He writes, the 33 great gods belong to the higher worlds, but rest in Swara, that is the domain of mind, and work at once in all the strata of consciousness. For the world is always one in its complexity. They are masters of the mental functions, masters also of the vital and material vital and material. Agni, for instance, governs the actions of the fiery elements in nature and in man, but is also the vehicle of pure tapas or divine force. They are therefore mankind's greatest helpers. So here, just in a gist, he gives you an example of how they're still primarily spiritual beings and powers working in the cosmos, although they have functions on all the planes, including the material. Obviously, when the Veda therefore describes the gods and their interrelations and the experiences in engaging with them, one can read the text on so many levels. Principally, you can read them at the domain of their originating consciousness, in the divine consciousness, in a divine symbol, or you can read them in the psychological domain where they function secondarily, or you can read them on a physical domain which they function in their lowest operations. And so the Vedic tradition itself says that all the verses of the Veda you can understand in the three words they use. In the domain of spirit, domain of psychology, and domain of matter. The words just slipped my mind now. But all of them can be read on three levels. If you look at them at a material level only, then obviously they represent powers and functions in nature. But as you read the verses, suddenly they speak of these very powers which you see as natural, leading you to great clarity, illumination, awakening of consciousness, and things which are obviously psychological. So even if you begin with a very material understanding, you're pushed to psychological understanding very quickly. And as you continue, again, there are passages where they open you out to things which are obviously purely spiritual. And so, bit by bit, you are led in your understanding of the verses to their highest function and meaning. But the point being, you can know them on all three levels and even use them on all three levels. As mantric powers on a material level, you can even engage with those very spiritual beings in their material operations in nature, and thus acquire even knowledge and control of things in physical nature, or within us, or in our psychological, or in our spiritual domain, both internal and external to us. Because the truth is being seen in a scope that includes all these. In the same text, Sri Aurobindo explains earlier that the domain of the mind, he explains these three domains. I'll read bullet point 7. In his progress, man is helped by the gods, resisted by the asuras and rakshasas, for the worlds behind have their own inhabitants, who, the whole universe being inextricably one, affect and are affected by the activities of mankind. So these beings of the subtle world, they affect us, and what we do affects them. As for example, in the current confusion we have created in nature and her processes, in the subtle worlds there is a huge chaos because of man's activities. That chaos comes back to us indirectly now through the disturbances in nature's processes, in the weather patterns and so on, which are in fact affected by our emotional and psychological states. And so there's a mutual exchange taking place across this barrier. And then he says, the bhuvar, the domain of the vital, is the great place of struggle in which forces work behind the visible movements we see here and determine all our actions. And then above that, in the swar of the mind, swar is man's resting place, but not his final or highest habitation, which is Vishnu's highest footing, high in the supreme, parardha, the upper half. So we have, as if in our evolution, come to rest in the mind, but it's not the final resting place. A step further. And these 33 great gods belong to the higher world, but on their part from above they come down and they rest in the swar, in the domain of mind, while working on all other planes. So here's a very interesting poise in evolution. Rising from below, we rest in the domain of the mind, obviously the higher ranges of the mind. Descending from above, in their functioning, the gods also take a pause and rest in the domain of the mind. And that's where the meeting takes place. They are mankind's greatest helpers. So bullet point 9, Sri Aurobindo says, but in order that they may help, it is necessary to reinforce them in these lower worlds which are not their own. Remember, they have moved out of their own home and they are operating in lower gradations of consciousness. They struggle therefore because they face resistance, opposition in their king, outside whom they are subject to whatever principle dominates there. So unless you welcome them into your home, they cannot be effective in their help in your home. They are guests, their power is only secondary. So it is necessary to reinforce them in these lower worlds which are not their own. How? By self-surrender, by sacrifice, by a share in all man's action, strength, being and bliss. And by this mutual help, man's being, physical, vital, mental, spiritual, is kept in a state of perfect and ever-increasing force, energy and joy, favorable to the development of immortality, the Satchidananda. This is the process of yajna. Yajna is understood as the Vedic fire sacrifice, but the term itself, Sri Aurobindo explains elsewhere, represents God in his aspect of movement and growth. So, this is the process of yajna, called often yoga, when applied exclusively to the subjective movements, and adhvara when applied to the objective. So I don't get into the detail, we skip that. The sacrifice is largely a battle between evolutionary and reactionary powers. So you get some sense here of this whole big picture of the Vedic view. And the last point of his description, bullet point 15, he says, the world being one in all its parts, every being in it contains the universe in himself. Especially do the great gods contain all the others and their activities in themselves. So that Agni, Varuna, Indra, the same three we are speaking of now, all of them are in reality one sole existent deity in many forms. You take this in. Agni, Varuna, Indra are all one sole deity in many forms. Now when you look back at the text and they are coming forward one by one, you can see how it is one deity coming forward, first in this form, then in that form, and then in a third form. And you see the continuum of evolution through these three grades. But that's not all. Sri Aurobindo completes with, man too is he. But he has to fulfill himself here as man, yet divine, through the puissant means provided for him by the Veda. So the divinity being, he notes in the bracket, this being his vrata and dharma. This is our innate, true being, nature, to be divine. So man too has to fulfill himself in order to realize that which he is. So with this background, with this big picture of the Vedic perspective, we turn now to the text, and you see how, although in the Upanishad, for the purpose of the story, the gods don't know their source and oneness, if you see the gods themselves in terms of that, the whole thing becomes very clear. Here we come back to the text. Here the three gods, Indra, Vayu, Agni, represent the cosmic divine on each of its three planes. Indra on the mental, Vayu on the vital, Agni on the material. In that order, therefore, beginning from the moment they approach the Brahman. But remember, being taking three distinct forms. Always one being. The oneness is always behind. We must remember, even though for the purpose of the story, we see now the distinctions, because that's how evolution moves, through distinctions. And now we move to Agni. He is the first who's being approached to find out the divine. Who is Agni? What does he represent? How is he related to these other? This Sri Aurobindo captures in the, and the key elements of it, of which Sri Aurobindo is elaborating, is verses themselves. We can therefore read the verses here, at least the three of the verses. Verse number 3. So the gods don't know who is this unknowable being. They said to Agni, O thou that knowest all things born, learn of this thing. What might be this mighty daemon? And he said, so be it. He rushed towards the eternal, and it said to him, who art thou? Remember, the daemon is asking the question. Who art thou? I am Agni, he said. I am he that knows all things born. Now it is not in pride, it is the natural being of him, who he is. And he just places himself, I am that. Why is he that knows all things born? Sri Aurobindo will explain. And then next verse. Since such thou art, what is the force in thee? Now this is very important. This whole conversation is profound. And as we explore it over the next few sessions, we will understand what does this mean in evolutionary terms. When the unknowable asks you, what is the force in you? Since such art thou, what is the force in thee? And Agni replies, even all this I could burn, all that is upon the earth. The eternal set before him a blade of grass. This burn. Again, in evolutionary terms, this has a profound meaning. And he made towards it with all his speed, but he could not burn it. There he ceased and turned back. And he says to the gods, I could not know of it what might be this mighty daemon. Then they turn to Vayu. Now this is the text, 4 verses. Now Sri Aurobindo is explaining what Agni represents here. Remember, he is the divine working in the material. Agni is the heat and flame of the conscious force in matter which has built up the universe. It is he who has made life and mind possible and developed them in the material universe where he is the greatest deity. And expands more, which we will see later. But just this first step we need to fully appreciate. Agni is the heat and flame of the conscious force in matter which has built up the universe. So in matter there is a conscious force. And of that conscious force, Agni is the heat and flame which builds up the universe, the form of the universe, the form of matter, the form of life in matter, the form of mind in matter. So all the forms, and matter is the domain of form, all the forms are Agni's working. Elsewhere in his commentaries on the Veda, he has an entire chapter describing Agni wonderfully, drawing from the lines of the Veda, expressing those in English. And one of the lines is describing how Agni is the first of the gods to enter the darkness of inconscience. All the others wait. They will not lose their light, they will not lose their illumination, their vastness and their freedom. It is Agni who enters first into the domain of complete inconscience, and there he works cowled, covered up in the darkness. And from within the darkness, wrapped inside the darkness, he works hard to build the forms. And as he builds the forms grow, the gods then begin to descend, to settle themselves into those forms. And that's how you have the evolution. Evolution is possible because within matter which was formless inconscience, utter darkness, nihil, there begins this impulse to create forms. And that impulse is the conscious force of the divine working in matter. He uses a different vocabulary in those other commentaries where he describes Agni as the divine will. It's the will of the divine embedded inside the inconscience, hidden in the darkness. You do not even see it, but from deep within inside it starts pushing, forming. And the whole effort is to create form. So you see, from the perspective of modern physics, in that inconscience, utter inconscience, you have only unstable waves of energy particles. All of them unstable. As they rise, they fall back. They rise and they fall back. They are described as virtual particles. They are not virtual, they are real. Except they are so unstable and so impermanent as to be unreal. And so you call them virtual particles. They interact with stable particles. And yet they are there almost unstably to such a degree that you can practically assume they are not there. And so there is this seething foam of energetic ripples of particles, and suddenly a few of them coalesce, join with others to create some stable movement. The movement itself is not stable. The overall movement appears stable while internally it is still as unstable as it was before. So instabilities combine to create a repeating instability, and the repetitiveness of the instability is what is the stable form. That's how you have your first particles. And then those combine to create larger stable forms. And the first stable form which resists being broken is the atom. And Sri Aurobindo points to this, and the huge amount of effort made to build this by the divine will working in matter in the darkness of inconscience. And Sri Aurobindo points to this appearance of the first atom, and he says this is the first type of the ego. What you see within us psychologically is a much more complex structure of ego. I resist anything which might shatter my I-ness, my separateness, my limited identity. But the same impulse of resisting, opposing external forces that might break is rooted all the way down in the atom. To have created the first stable structures of the atom is such a huge achievement in evolution, and Agni does all that work. And then he builds by combining the atoms all the way up to our human body form. But already as this process begins, he creates structures within which the gods can begin to inhabit, however partially, growing within. And so, in Agni's working in the material universe, he makes life and mind possible. Although life properly is the domain of Vayu, mind is properly the domain of Indra, they begin to inhabit these forms because Agni builds for them. And as long as we are in the domain of form and matter, Indra and Vayu are subordinate to the larger working of Agni. But wherever Agni works, they are also present. Remember, they were never really separate. They are just one deity. So even as Agni was working and he creates the forms, he awakens in them Vayu through his own working. He awakens in them Indra. That is, he awakens life and mind as the forms are built up. And so in the evolution, we see this extraordinary happening. What was utter inconscience not only now begins to express forms, but out of that inconscient material form is the emergence of life and mind. Who does all this? The hard work of Agni. What emerges through him in all the other gods? Well, it is still his working that makes possible their appearance. But as he draws them out of himself in the working from below, naturally the working of Vayu and Indra here resonates with the freer working of Vayu and Indra in the cosmos, and the two align. As from within the Vayu reaches upwards, life force reaches upwards, from above the free working of Vayu engages. The limited individual ego life is met by the free cosmic working of life. And as the two join from above, there is an infusion, widening and speeding up. And as that begins, Vayu begins to form in his proper domain on the base of what Agni has created. The transition is a continuum. It is not this then that. It is a continuous process. And in exactly the same way as the life forms emerge and are organized, mind within them is beginning to be pushed out, and the cosmic mind then aligns and assists infusing itself, drawing up the lower, filling it with the higher, expanding and speeding up the evolution, and suddenly mind rapidly comes into its own, assisted from above and struggling from below. Again a continuum. And the mind was always there from the beginning, latent, emerging gradually. Life was always there from the beginning, latent, emerging gradually in Agni's work. Now when you see Agni, Vayu and Indra as one deity taking three different forms, the continuum is so obvious, and this is the Vedic vision. When you reduce it now to the rational mind, you'll say, Agni, separate Vayu, separate Indra, and they are working together, and there is this complex working, which also is true, but it is their secondary and superficial appearance of relationship and working. The truth is the underlying oneness of their evolution and their triple appearance. So Sri Aurobindo writes here, Agni is the heat and flame of the conscious force in matter which has built up the universe. It is he who has made life and mind possible and developed them in the material universe, where he is the greatest deity. Especially, he is the primary impeller of speech, of which Vayu is the medium and Indra the Lord. Now you see their triple working. You cannot separate them. The impelling force, remember Agni is this will pushing. So the impelling force of any expression, remember speech is not just our mouth making sounds, it is the whole creative emergence which expresses, which manifests. And so the impeller is Agni, and then who brings into that the widening space in which the speech takes form, that is Vayu as medium, and Indra the Lord holding the meaning of what is being expressed. Which is the more important? Obviously the Lord. And yet the impeller is always Agni and Vayu is the medium. You cannot separate them. They're just one taking a triple status. This heat of conscious force in matter is Agni Jata Vedas. the knower of all births, of all things born, of every cosmic phenomenon. He knows the law, the process, the limit, the relation. Now this we can only understand if we recognize what role Agni has played in this formation. Remember, it is he who built up from the underlying unstable inconscience every form that has emerged. All of the knowledge of physics is his working. And if you know the law of everything in matter, well, obviously, you know everything working out there, isn't it? So of all things born, of every cosmic phenomenon, he knows the law. Not only the law because he sets. He knows the process by which these things emerge. The limit, because every time something is built up, it is defined by limits and forms. And the relation between all these different pieces, he holds it all. And so these four words are critical. He knows the law, the process, the limit, the relation. And in these four, all the form, universe of forms, the material universe, is known and captured. We have still not touched upon two key words when he says Agni is the heat and flame of the conscious force and matter by which this is built up. And we have to understand that in all of these steps, heat and flame are working. And in heat and flame, you will see the intensity of the heat, which is the will pushing, which is what you associate with the friction, with an energetic compression, and the flame which emerges from the heat, it lights up. You rub, there's the heat, and at some point, poof, it bursts and there's the flame. What does the flame do? It gives light. Will, knowledge. These two working together. But first is the friction of the will struggling until the will breaks through and there's the illumination of the knowledge. If you look at all the material processes, you look at the physics of it, the struggle of particles pushing, hitting, bouncing against each other until they catch. And when they catch, there is the rippling out of what we call light. Physically, it is the radiation. So initially there is the heat aspect, it grows until it bursts out in a radiation. So you look at an atom, it radiates energy. It absorbs energy, radiates energy. But in order to build it up, there was the initial process of the heat. And this is true of every level. In fact, broadly speaking, there are three levels at which Agni operates in forming matter. So in the Veda, they speak of these three levels as Jada, Vaidyut and Saurya. That is, Jada is the dense, gross, heavy, and Vaidyut is the electric, and Saurya is the solar. And they represent three levels of this organization of energy. At all three levels, you have the heat-light experience. In its most material, obvious form, Jada is the level where you see a chemical fire. You light a match. What is burning is the gross material itself. It gives heat, it gives light, in different degrees. The electric, interestingly, is of a higher grade. It does not always so obviously consume with heat and light. Lightning would be one obvious aspect, but in terms of physics, we would say the Jada Agni is where the entire molecular structure is engaged, built or destroyed. So the matchstick becomes black when it is burnt, it's destroyed, it's broken up, it's eaten up by the Agni. But in the electric fire, as you may see in the bulb or in the lightning, the material is not destroyed, and the primary engagement is not at a molecular level but at the electronic exchange of electrons, and that too only the superficial electrons of the atom, not the core electrons. So the electric spark, the lightning, the electricity, and the electric light, which does not burn, which does not consume, but it gives off heat and light. Depending on how we shift the emphasis, the same filament can give off more heat, less light, or more light, less heat. And it's just a question of tuning, but they're both always there. You can never separate them. And then in the third grade, which is Saurya, of the nature of the sun, something much more fundamental is happening. What we today call nuclear reactions, which we associate with the sun, where not the peripheral electrons but the internal atomic structure is modified. Two atoms of hydrogen fuse to become helium, giving off heat and light. And when this is done in a sufficiently large scale, you have the huge release of heat and light in what is called the hydrogen bomb, or in the splitting of the atom in the atom bomb. And that is much more fundamental, much more essential, but also much more powerful. So these are three gradations of Agni's working. Everywhere is the heat and light. They are all expressions of the conscious force in matter. And therefore this conscious force working in matter is Jata Vedas, the knower of all births. Anything in the universe which is born, it knows because it created it. There is nothing else. There was nothing before him. And so he is the knower of all births, of all things born, of every cosmic phenomenon. He knows the law, the process, the limit, the relation. If then it is some mighty birth in the cosmos that stands before them, some new indeterminate developed in the cosmic struggle and process, who shall know him, determine his limits, strength, potentialities, if not Agni Jata Vedas? Therefore, Agni is sent first. So this last line we will review next Sunday and then move on to the next step. What happens when he meets and he's asked, what is the force in you? You can see this is a very fascinating elaboration, the full understanding of which we could never have gained if not for Sri Aurobindo's detailed commentary. But even his commentary is so compact, you have to dwell on each word to be able to appreciate all the nuances that he brings in, and sometimes cross-reference with other texts where he elaborates on some of these key ideas. So we can meditate on this whole impulse within us of Agni, which is the first step in our effort to know the divine. In us, in a highest status, it takes the form of our aspiration. The flame deep within us, which has its own heat and light, which seeks to know and to realize the divine.